Olá, bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite. I'm Carla.
And I'm the hubby, I'm Marlon.
And together we're the founders of Portuguese with Carla. And today we will be sharing with you 4 mistakes, things that you shouldn't do when learning a new language. This is how we feel about it. And things you should do in order to learn it more effectively. But before we do that, we just want to give you a little bit of an idea of who we are and how we got to teach Portuguese the way we do.
So we were, taught English at school, traditional method, but we really did struggle when we moved to England, right? When put in a position where we had to speak the language. And we only really learned English once we were in the country. And sort of the experience of learning the language and the techniques that we use and how we went about it made us think about language learning and teaching languages. And so we got into a linguistic vibe. We developed an appetite for linguistic research and how the brain handles language, which is fascinating. And so Carla likes to teach. I don't have the patience so much to teach. So you started one-on-one for a little while.
Eventually we created the course that we now have, the journey, with content there that could be accessed by anybody, wherever they may be.
Yeah. So anyway, that being said,
4 mistakes you shouldn't fall into if you want to learn the language more effectively and quickly. Mistake number 1 is to focus on vocabulary alone. So remember that what we're saying here is not don't focus at all. No, just don't focus on it alone. Don't make it your priority.
Yeah.
So thinking or trying to memorize lists of words is not that helpful when you want to communicate. Sometimes, yes, you can use the key word and people understand what you're trying to say, but many words or one word can have many different meanings, and it's only by the context that you realize what the person is trying to say.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the first thing, this is the reaction people have. I'm going to learn Portuguese. What do? They go to their phone and they download an app or 2 on vocabulary, right? Be it Drops, be it Memrise, Anki, and there's a bunch of others. Yeah. But these, they're okay, but again, words ought to be learned in context. There's research that shows that it's only after being exposed to a word in context, after some 30 times, then you'll be able to use it in real life.
Yeah.
But and we make sure that when we teach, we always give you a platform where you can use the word or learn it in context or in the context of a dialogue, a phrase.
Yeah.
And
then look into it a bit more.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example in English very quickly. Will. What am I saying?
Could be a name, could be I will, verb, could be.
As in having the will to do something. That was one that took me a while to understand or to learn. Mm-hmm. But I knew will was used for the future. That was the only meaning I knew. But when you think of the phrase like Will's will is for his will to, can you make sense of that?
Yeah, I can, but I see your point.
Interesting, isn't it? So when you see it in context, then it's easier for you to remember what it means and to use it.
And there's better ways of learning vocabulary. Later on, we'll tell you what we think is an excellent strategy to learn vocabulary faster. Mistake number 2.
Focusing on grammar. Again, grammar has its place, but if you try to learn grammar first, okay, now I need to understand the mechanisms of the language, I need to understand the structure of the language before I'm able to understand what people are saying or before I'm able to speak it.
That's the problem. I'm just going to read here a comment that we got about a month ago from one of our students. He said, many years ago, I was in the Canary Islands and made friends with a guy from Bangladesh. He was obsessed with Spanish verb conjugations and could rattle them off rapid fire with his staccato accent. One day we went out for lunch at a local dive called Jeremiah's, and the poor guy couldn't even order food in Spanish. The waiter was not very sympathetic and made him point at things. Big lesson for me. What was the problem here? Problem is, there is a difference between knowing the rules of a language, between knowing grammar consciously and being able to use the grammar in conversation unconsciously. There's a big difference and they're not the same thing. Just to give you 3 examples specifically, just to make our point, and Carla, you were talking about this earlier. You don't know the rules of the language that you are speaking as a native.
Not unless you teach it.
Yeah, you
Generally,
might know
that's the
some
way.
rules,
Yeah.
but you don't know them all. And
Oh no, yeah, it's very complex.
that's what linguists do. They study the language for years in order to understand the patterns of their own language. Let me give an example of something you probably don't know about the English language, if that is your native. For example, the expression used to. I used to go to the park. I used to swim when I was younger. Now you might see written down used to, but you would never pronounce it like that when that expression is referring to an habitual action in the past. That's actually something you learn in Portuguese called the imperfect past, something you had the habit of doing in the past.
The custom.
But that exists in English and most people don't realize it. So for example, I can ask you the question, what was this hammer used for? And you will say to me, that hammer was used to build a house. You would never say that hammer was used to build a house.
So the difference is in the way you pronounce that S mainly, isn't it? Used and used, and the T-O.
And the T-O, right? But at the same time, you would say, I used to go to the park. You would never say, I used to go to the park. It's a subtle difference, but it's a proved point in linguistics. You don't realize it's there. You don't realize that pronunciation shift, but that's grammar. Your brain absolutely knows about it and is able to use it without an issue. But you don't know about it, or most likely you didn't, right? Yeah, I didn't know about it until I read about it in fantastic author John McWhorter, if you want to look him up.
It does happen with a few other words. One that I sort of came across was just one day, I don't know, I was thinking about it and the word close and close. You say, this is, or close the door, or this is close to you. It's different, isn't it? It's the exact same word, but one is pronounced with a Z kind of sound, close, and the other one more like an S, close. And you know exactly which one to use in the right context without even realizing.
Exactly. Another example is in studies have shown that somebody who has perhaps had an accident might not be able to speak very well. Maybe the grammar doesn't come out well. Often that's called Broca's aphasia. Now that person, in some cases, they're able to explain to you what the grammar rule is and tell you this is how it works in my language, but they're not able to use it while speaking, interestingly. So there's a difference between what you know consciously and what your brain, your unconscious brain, is able to use when speaking the language.
And another point is, or another example would be children. When it comes to verbs, for example, there are verbs that follow regular patterns, so we call them regular verbs. In English, the ones that end with ed when you're trying to form the past. So I loved, or I caused, whatever. So sometimes they apply that to the irregular. Not sometimes, but they will always do that with the irregular ones. I hurted, or
I eated
rather than I ate, or I hurt. So it's natural for them. But in time, as they get more and more exposure to it, their brain will pick that up and they will be able, there's no point in you insisting that they will get it right immediately.
In fact,
it's
that
good,
doesn't work.
No, it's good to actually make sure that they're hearing the words pronounced correctly. And eventually, the brain will pick it up and they will pronounce it the right way.
Exactly. So the parents might tell them, this is how it is, little Johnny, but it doesn't work. Until the age of about 5, they won't say it. They'll need to get enough exposure and eventually the brain automatically will get there.
How many times have I corrected a student on a particular point
Yeah.
and he didn't get it until later because of having repeated
Exposure.
Yeah.
The point is, more and more it seems like we're coming to an understanding that language is an instinct. What do we mean by that? You don't have to consciously think about it or consciously even learn it. Just like you don't have to ask someone to tell you how to walk or ride a bike. It comes instinctively to you how to use your limbs. You don't have to tell, oh, this muscle must move in this direction or pull this much weight.
automatically
your brain will do those things.
It's as if the brain was designed.
And that's what it is. Researchers now are coming to the conclusion that we have a dedicated area of the brain that is designed to, has all the frameworks to be able to learn a language, even build language in some cases. Children, for example, who are, families that move to a foreign country, maybe they don't learn the language very well.
Perfectly.
That becomes a pidgin. It's a pidgin language. So they pick it up, but it's not great. The next generation will create the patterns of this new language called the Creole by themselves. There's no grammarian that comes in and tells you, hey kids, this is how the new language is going to be. No, automatically, the brains create a pattern. Language is an instinct. And so there's no point in trying to, it's a waste of time, and most of the time, to try and force that language into your brain consciously.
Oh, it's interesting, isn't it? We do have it in our course. We do include several videos of grammar, and it's interesting to learn about it, to explore a little bit, but it shouldn't be the focus when you start to learn Portuguese. Now, there was someone we had mentioning that he felt like there was a major problem with this tip, with this that we call
the
mistake.
Approach,
yeah, not focusing on grammar, because he feels like that's only valid for the quote. I can quote it. It's only valid for children 12 years of age or younger, or a certain type of adults. Grown-ups aren't children, and their ability to rapidly deduce rules and patterns is very much eroded. For many people, knowing the mechanism before listening or speaking is essential. These people simply fail every time they try to learn with the no grammar methods. As for those who do learn without studying grammar, their proficiency very rarely reaches an advanced level. I think we learned without grammar, and we have reached fluency.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think you need grammar, you will need grammar. You're always going to be questioning the whys, the whats, trying to compare it to your own language. How does this work with my language? What's the translation?
You can create this barrier. And it's not because you want to. Sometimes you just feel really frustrated. It's like, no, but I need to understand. I can't understand. But if you relax about it, and if you just, okay, now let me try the natural way of learning a language. How did I learn my mother tongue? Just by exposure. So if you were to try that with an open mind, in a relaxed way, you will be pleasantly surprised.
And we see this every day with our students.
And friends, people we know, ourselves.
Exactly. Now there is, of course, there's a difference between you as a child and you as an adult. There is a time up until, he's right, the age of 12 or thereabouts, where a child can learn a language faster.
They'll absorb anything around
Absolutely. Pronunciation, if you learn a new language after the age of 12, it's pretty hard to get that pronunciation spot on.
You mean the accent sort of? Well, I guess that's
the accent, pronunciation.
Pronunciation is very close to accent.
But the brain doesn't suddenly change into a completely different thing. You will still pick up the language the same way. The mechanisms for learning languages are still there. That framework we were talking about is still there. It just slows down a little bit. We recently went, not recently, maybe 2 or 3 years back, we went on a course, Romanian course, and we could see that people, maybe some of our co-students, they were desperate trying to figure out why, but teacher, why is it? And generally speaking, those, unfortunately, are the ones that struggle. It becomes a hindrance to their progress.
They actually felt that our level was much more advanced because we had had 1 year of exposure to the language without even considering grammar. And I was able to work out some of the verbs. I remember doing an exercise where they say, it was an irregular verb. And they say, okay, so how do you conjugate that particular verb? And nobody knew. And I was like, I feel like this one, you should throw in this letter there. I think the sound of it like that is the right way. Even now when we're speaking English, we might make 1 or 2 mistakes or more, but we're often aware that we haven't said something quite right.
Yeah, we go back.
Sometimes we go back, sometimes we don't bother because we just want it to flow. We just want to be able to communicate.
It's that unconscious side of things. There's something also about children that maybe we can learn from. Children tend to be humble when it comes to learning languages. It's not just that they don't ask the whys when it comes to language learning. They also don't trying to argue with you as to...
They don't question it. If you say that this is how we say it, then okay. I mean, they have a lot of whys this, why that. But when it comes to this is how you speak, okay, they just take it and eventually they will copy you.
And by the way, even we were a bit like that to a certain extent. I mean, when you started learning, for example, Romanian,
Yeah, or English, you have to. I know that sometimes it might sound like a weakness, being humble, but actually it is a strength. Because if you're humble, you're willing to be corrected. You're willing to be told. And you're willing to make the change so that you do it right.
Yeah. Now, I was thinking about the fact that even you at the beginning sort of asked questions as to why things are.
But why? It's so annoying. I think this is an adult thing, isn't it?
Absolutely,
We feel like we feel, not that it is, but we feel the need.
The need for speed.
To understand. But you can't. Sometimes often there's no literal translations from one thing to another.
Yeah.
You know, I remember even when learning English at school, this I will do. But what is this will? What does it translate into when it's referring to the future? It's nothing. You can't translate it.
Yeah, and sometimes you do. There's things called pragmatic markers in language where you literally cannot translate it. Of course, you can translate the feeling, but if you're trying to translate the word, it just doesn't work. What is your end goal? What are you trying to do? Communicate. That's your goal, communicate. And if that's your goal, focusing on lists of vocabulary, focusing on grammar, is just not the best way to use your time. Mistake number 3.
So dumb down or correct Portuguese. So one thing that many people will do when teaching a language sometimes is slowing it down to the point that is not realistic. It's not how people speak. So then when you go into the real world, or when you're listening to something at normal speed, you have no clue what they're saying. And how do you feel? Super frustrated.
Yeah.
And that can happen after years of exposure to the language, but the wrong type of exposure. This is why we find it very important to expose yourself to normal speed Portuguese or whatever language you might be learning.
What we mean by that is when somebody, for example, records a piece of content for you, but they purposely slow down the way they read. The sounds will be different from the sounds of the Portuguese language when they're speaking at a regular, normal speed. Now, it's one thing to record at normal speed and then programmatically slow things down so you can hear the correct sounds of the language, like going like this, going like this. That's okay, mostly. The problem is when you purposely read something slowly, okay? Because then the sounds of the language will be different. You had a couple of examples there.
So when you ask for something, when you say please in Portuguese, often it's por favor. But another very common way of saying it, it's se faz favor. Se faz favor. Nobody says it that way really. We say se faz favor. The second F just goes away. So if you were to learn the words in a very slow way, then we have to pronounce each word properly so you can hear it. But then when you hear it in the real world, it's just not going to sound the same. And you think, what is she saying? And it's actually something that you should know. It's something basic. And when you realize what the person was saying, you feel like, please, that's it. That's what all she was saying. So this is the importance of being exposed to real speed. I don't think there's anything wrong in listening to the words being pronounced in a slow way, as long as you are exposed to the right way or the common way of pronouncing a particular word. But if I isolate, another example is the S in Portuguese. It has 4 different sounds. So if I was to say, essas asas são boas, so those wings are good, like chicken wings, you know, essas asas são boas. So you can hear a lot of shushes, but there's only going to be 2 shushes instead of 4 if I say it at a normal speed. Essas asas são boas. Because you only hear the S in between vowels, regardless of the fact that the vowels are in a part of the same word, is pronounced like a Z. So essas asas, that's 2 words. It might sound like just 1, but that's in the beginning. You know, it feels like one giant word, but in time It sounds
like Carla's saying, change, you know? If you say, I am learning, estou a aprender, that's if you ask somebody to read it slowly, that's how they would say it, estou a aprender. In real life, nobody says it like that. We say, estou a aprender, or estou a aprender. The A becomes an open A and only one. In the beginning, the ES disappears oftentimes. This is the point. Be careful what content you're listening to. Don't follow necessarily a lot of content that is purposely slowed down for you, that ends up giving you a false sense of security. Okay, it makes it harder for then picking up language in the real world.
And mistake number 4, it's waiting to communicate in the target language until you're perfect at it.
Well, you're never going to be anyway, but yeah.
How can you achieve perfection or fluency if you're not using it? You have to use it. Don't shy away. I know it's difficult. I can relate. I've had my moments where I didn't want to speak, was a bit discouraged, or I felt that I just have that lack of confidence. But then I forced myself to do it. You can't give up. You have to. It is uncomfortable because you're not a child anymore. You're a grown-up and you want to be able to speak properly and communicate without having any issues.
And not being laughed at, which sometimes is.
Yeah, I don't appreciate being laughed at. When I'm trying to say a word, in a foreign word or a foreign language, a word, or trying to say something, and then it depends how people laugh at it. They can really focus on it and like make a big thing, and that's all they talk about.
But it is good. It is beneficial when it comes to language learning to be out of your comfort zone. Just a personal experience, when we started learning Romanian, within very few months, we weren't intensive at learning it. We were just being exposed to it, maybe 3 times a week. We spent time with folks who were natives. So we didn't know a lot at that point. But we decided to go to Romania for 2 weeks. And it was amazing. We perhaps didn't notice how big of an impact it had on us to be in the midst of people who, by the way, did not speak English in the area where we were. But when we came back, our friends were like, wow, you really did improve quite a bit.
It was just 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Yeah, of exposure, listening to them speak, making conversation with the very basic Romanian that we had at the time. Just like, I'm not Romanian, I'm from Portugal, but I've been learning Romanian, I'm trying to. Then people get interested and I ask you more questions. And they're so interested that they don't care if you're making mistakes, and even though we weren't speaking it or saying things in the right way, as in correctly, we were able to make ourselves understood, generally speaking.
And that's not being able to say things correctly, but being a little bit more adventurous, perhaps, than you would think you're capable of. That's the way you're going to learn the language, okay?
Don't be afraid of using gestures or facial expressions.
True. And people that apply these techniques, should I say, people that avoid these mistakes and apply the techniques that we're going to mention later, and we've mentioned kind of briefly already, they do see a massive difference, even if they've been learning for a while. I'll give you one example or two. Melza, one of our students, he was saying, I finished lesson 3 so far, based on the lessons last week. I actually had a full conversation with my barber, got a nice trim for my birthday, had a taxi, I spoke to a taxi driver at the restaurant, placing my order, and at the supermarket. I know it was a bit distorted, but they understood me and I was able to understand them, even though I had to tell them to speak a bit slowly. It was no longer just bom dia, olá, sim, no.
How do you think this person felt? After, one day he gets to go to the barber, taxi driver, restaurant, placing an order.
Feel elated, wouldn't you?
Amazing, super motivated, let's keep going. Even though he realizes that it was a bit distorted, but he was able to communicate.
Exactly. Another example, just a few weeks ago, we didn't ask for them, these comments, but they just came through. Mare, she was saying, since I started the journey, it's quite funny, I have not listened to my beloved but utterly cryptic radio Antena Vida, radio station in Portugal. I just did, as in listen to the radio whilst making dinner. Amazing. They talk much slower and are making much more of an effort to make themselves understood. How on earth did you get them to do that? The pace of progress is indeed miraculous.
So they were not speaking slower,
No.
but she could make out the words they were saying because she exposed herself to the normal pace of Portuguese, spoken Portuguese.
From the start, I mean, this is, we try to apply these rules that we talked about the best as we can. So when we teach people from the start, full speed Portuguese, right? We help you with pronunciation. We don't leave you in the dark. We help you even if you're a complete beginner, but you have to have that exposure.
Okay, so let's go into practical ideas. So how to prepare or how to get started learning the language even before you move to the country, because you might not even be moving to Portugal.
5 points.
But what should you do? Exactly. So first one would be pronunciation. We are hot on pronunciation. If you don't pronounce things properly, then you think that word, when you hear the word and it's being pronounced differently, you don't associate it with a word you knew. If you learn how to pronounce things properly, you will be able to understand others when they say it, and you will be able to make yourself understood. It doesn't take much sometimes, unfortunately, to be misunderstood. Okay, if you mispronounce something, people might not get.
Difference. So really, that should be your focus we feel from the start. Get that pronunciation nailed down and maybe pick up the speed a little bit.
Don't try and reach for perfection, but just try and do your best, your very best. The closest you are to the right pronunciation, and don't get me wrong, I mean, there's different accents in Portugal, so people pronounce things slightly different, but we give you the standard Portuguese pronunciation. So if you are able to do that, then you should be able to make yourself understood.
We feel this is really important because we realize that from our own experience learning foreign languages, this has been extremely useful. So there's a reason why, we teach you how to pronounce every single phoneme in the Portuguese language, every single sound of the Portuguese language. So we start with that. That's a focus at the start. And you can do that on your own. For example, by using a technique called shadowing, where you listen to content in Portuguese or any other language, and you repeat it at the same time or just after the person is saying it. Okay, linguists.
It's like singing along.
It's a little bit like that, and there is something connected to that called the phonological loop. So your brain starts to associate a movement of the mouth with the sound that you're hearing and making at the same time. It is incredibly valuable. Lots of polyglots will swear by it. We'll talk a little bit more about how you can do that with a useful tip later on.
Something else that is very important that you should do right away is exposure. And I think we've touched on that on this presentation already. Expose yourself to the language.
As much as possible.
Radio, TV, speaking to people, going to the country, listening to music in that target language.
Yeah, while washing the car, while cleaning the house. It takes 5 years, remember, for children, generally speaking, to nail irregular verbs. The sooner you start, the better, right?
But be patient, okay? Be patient with yourself. I know patience is not a quality that many people have so easily these days because life is fast, you have lots to do, places to be. So, but be patient with yourself. You will get there.
Try not to compare yourself to others. A lot of folks say, "Oh, I'm not good at languages. That person is good at languages." That is mostly exaggerated. Being good at languages, there's obviously a little bit of an advantage that some people have. But I remember reading this point in a fascinating book called Babel No More about polyglots and how they get to be polyglots. And their secret, polyglots tend to be very organized, very methodical people. They practice lots. That's eventually how they get to be polyglots. But even polyglots, people say, "Oh, I speak 6, 12 languages, even more." It's very, very difficult, and it's rare for someone to speak more than 2, perhaps 3 languages at a native level. Very rare. The reason being, when you start to focus on a new language, you start to lose a little bit of the other ones, right? We've noticed that already. Like we start to lose a bit of the English when we started focusing on Romanian. Even the patterns of grammar, you start to confuse them a little bit in your mind. What am I trying to say with this? Don't be discouraged. You don't have a problem with languages. Otherwise, you speak perfect English or whatever your native tongue is. You don't have a problem with that. You don't have a problem with languages. Problems with languages are aphasia, and they're serious issues. You don't have it. What you need to is a good mentality about learning a language and enough exposure, enough practice. You will learn it, okay?
After exposure, we have...
Sorry, Carla, just before you get there, I just want to mention that we will provide you with a list of exposure items. So Carla was saying earlier about TV, YouTube, podcasts, a bunch of stuff. We prepared a list that you can use to both do the shadowing as well as do, watching while you're at home or listening while you're on the go. Just pick up a subject that you actually enjoy.
And in fact, if you're watching something and if you're able to turn on the subtitles in the target language, so if you're watching to something in Portuguese, make sure that the subtitles are also in Portuguese. So you're listening and seeing the words, how they're written and how they're pronounced. So then you get used to the way they are spelled to the way they are pronounced. And also you can see the person's mouth moving, which is also very beneficial for many people. Not so much when you have to speak on the phone, but generally when you're having a conversation with somebody, it is helpful to look at their lips. So the other thing that we should do is joining conversation groups, if possible. Now you could find maybe the next door neighbor, is willing to have a chat, is curious about you. Portuguese are usually quite curious people.
But this is perhaps even if you don't
before
live
you
in...
move, yeah.
So we know this is important on our website. We provide a way for people to communicate. We have weekly sessions of practice. But you could use services like talkabroad.com, Hello Talk, Hello Pal, Tandem. There's lots of other services. The idea is if you can, try to, even one-on-one teacher if you can afford one. That will be excellent.
Some people are willing to sort of language swap kind of thing.
True.
So they want to do a bit of English with you, and then you can do a bit of Portuguese with them, and that's also very helpful. So yeah, just try and find somebody who's willing to chat to you in Portuguese in a natural sort of kind of way, and then slowly build up on that. Don't worry about understanding everything. You won't.
So another tip would be, in order to learn vocabulary, you can use apps like Anki, Memrise and Drops and others, but it is much more efficient if you create your own lists, okay, of vocabulary. Okay, and organize them yourselves, create them by hand if possible. But we have a few tips. We can share a video that we did on this subject and an article that we wrote on it. And then once you've created your own list and added this point to your list, try to use that piece of vocabulary, that new word, in context as soon as possible. Within the first 3 days, try and use it as many times as possible.
So it's not just about focusing on lists of words, but actually using them in context. So as we said earlier, and the way you learn these lists or these words, there's effective ways of doing it.
And even if you don't have the chance of using these expressions or new words you've picked up that you heard perhaps on the radio, heard on YouTube channel, if you don't have anyone to converse with, create a small, short, maybe even 2-line dialogue. Just write it down. The process of creating a dialogue, even if it's just a 2-line dialogue with that word, is going to help you retain that piece of information, store it in your brain to be able to use again.
Something else you can do if you're not there, if you're not moving there, it's, like in the country of the target language, Portugal in this case, is by taking an online course, finding an online teacher or an online program that will actually cover or include all of these practical aspects that we find is effective or are effective in helping you to learn
and one that will give you as much exposure as possible. And not just, this is how you say this. One that actually, through perhaps dialogues or stories, sketches, scenes, whatever it may be, that one that gives you real life conversational dialogues. Also,
you do want structure, so it's got to be well organized, isn't it? I mean, that's something that we've seen as we were building our platform, how people felt the need to see that they were progressing, giving them that sense of progression so that they wouldn't lose the motivation.
So it's to be said, some people do like to jump from this subject to this subject, but generally speaking, if you don't have a clear path, people seem to give up. faster because they don't know where to go and they don't have a clear structure given to them, a clear curriculum given to them. And try to do a little bit every day. And this applies to everything that we just talked about. A little bit every day is better. Goes a long way. Okay. It's better than a chunk today and then nothing tomorrow. Tomorrow,
next week, and then you go again. It's quite frustrating, demoralizing. So we usually say, because that's the ideal situation if you're not living in a country, if you're not getting that regular exposure, is to try and do a little bit of Portuguese 2 hours a day. Now, that may not be realistic for many because of work, life. So it doesn't matter, do 5 minutes, do 10 minutes, but do something every day. Even if it's just saying a few words to yourself or a few phrases, you know, as you're taking a shower or...
If you want a little bit more, the scope of this video doesn't really go that far, but if you want a little bit more on how to create a habit to practice Portuguese or anything else, to be honest, there's really interesting couple of books that you might want to read or tackle into Atomic Habits and Tiny Habits. They will help you to create the habit of studying a little bit, of listening to something. And it's really, really useful for those learning languages. It's useful for everything, but to learn languages, I think it'll be very beneficial. Once you move to the country, to Portugal, in this case, what can you do, Carla?
One thing is go to local places like restaurants or shops. Don't try and find the shops where you know people are going to speak your language, your mother tongue. You have to be able to fit in, sort of try and mingle with the locals, you know. I know it's uncomfortable, but it is effective. And once you do it and you have a nice experience, then you want more of that. It's true, you might, and you probably will have bad experiences where people, not everybody is friendly. Most Portuguese people are, but one or two may be grumpy. It might be that they're grumpy that day because they're having a bad day, but generally they're super friendly and they really appreciate the fact that you tried. They tend to be grumpier with those who don't even try to speak Portuguese, because you're in the country. You should be making an effort. It shows respect and, I guess, appreciation for the people.
The problem that you might have sometimes is that Portuguese love to practice their English. Some students find it useful to be a little bit more, how can I put it, assertive. So if you speak Portuguese to someone and they answer in English because they realize you're a foreigner, answer back in Portuguese. Or even learn a simple phrase. Podemos falar em português?
Yeah.
Can we speak in Portuguese?
Even in English you could say, I'm sorry, I'm really trying to learn Portuguese. Is there a chance we could just speak in Portuguese? You know, it'd be really helpful. I'd really appreciate it. And most Portuguese would really be willing to do that. If they have the time, you know, they love helping others. They're very hospitable, aren't they, in general, Portuguese?
If you mingle, like Carla was saying, if you get yourself into those situations where there's not a lot of people who speak English and they're not used to that, you learn the culture a little bit as well. I think linguists say that something like only 30% of communication is done through words. Everything else is a little bit connected, or more connected to culture. And you'll pick that up if you mingle, if you get yourself into the midst of...
Sometimes just a sound, you know, like a gesture, it can say so much, can't it?
Yeah.
And sometimes it might come across a bit weird. You don't know what the person is trying to say. Sometimes the Romanians do that. They can be a little bit more, the ones I know can be a little bit abrupt in the way they're saying things, or just the tone that they've used to say something. But actually, they're just actually being very casual, very laid back, playing with each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so it's actually quite good to find somebody immediately that you are able to talk to in Portuguese. So you move there, or you go to a hotel, talk to the receptionist, try and say a few words, you know, or to the person that works at the food place, the canteen, or whatever you call it. Can't think of it.
Or leave your neighbor, you strike up a conversation with your neighbor, see if you can help them. We had an interesting comment the other day that one of our students was able to do that, and she felt great, not only because there's greater happiness in giving, after all, than there is in receiving, but there is also that accomplishment of having been able to communicate, even if just using the little Portuguese that you have.
Yeah, so those are our tips.
Yeah.
and suggestions. Yeah.
And we believe that if you apply these and avoid the mistakes we talked about, you will learn. You will learn. You'll become as fluent as you possibly can, given the amount of time that you put into it. Now, to help you out, we actually have a 30-day free, plan, yeah? And you can follow that. There's audio content, there's some written content in there. But it's just, and every day you'll be able to, we'll tell you what to do. Okay, you won't be guessing as to what you should be doing. Should I be doing more or less?
Yeah.
You know.
Some of the stuff is just playing something in the background, listening to something, so you don't actually have to be sitting somewhere looking at a screen.
Yeah. So,
wish you all the best, and hopefully, maybe, we'll see you again.
Ciao, ciao.